has entered the new age of cyber wars. It is language that is being used as the main weapon in virtual battles. The ongoing war has many striking features. One of them is that this is the first war in the history of Europe unfolding in front of the entire world in an online mode. Ukrainians have used social media to chronicle the war, counter Russian propaganda, grieve, laugh, and above all support each other through a difficult time. My talk will briefly explore the repurposed folklore that the war inspired. I should say that Ukrainians are challenging the Putin myth with the weapon of art and digital folklore, or people's direct, sustained engagement through technology in ways that span the globe. This is how I understand digital folklore. As renowned Ukrainian sociolinguist Larissa Masenko put it, quote, "Language turns into a weapon. The humor of the Ukrainian people has become a kind of meaningful anti-aircraft defense, which helps to defend against Russian propaganda." I say on my part that the Ukrainian language has become a means of resistance and a weapon, a kind of Bayraktar, if you wish, that destroys the Kremlin's plans for enslavement and assimilation. Please, the next slide. Since the start of war in 1914, Putin's geopolitical values have been dismantled by Ukrainians on social media platforms. For instance, thank you. This philological witticism humorously points at the impossibility to say in Russian, "I will win." It is "переможу" in Ukrainian because of grammatical lacune. A philological curse of the Russian world, I'm quoting from this witticism. It is what happens when the desire is there and the ambitions are pressing, but the great and powerful, this is how the Russian language is called by Russians, according to Ivan Turgenev, following his quote. Russian language does not provide for their implementation, because no matter how militant someone's self is, the word "I will win," Ukrainian "переможу," does not exist in the Russian language. See the great academic dictionary of the Russian language. Humorous deconstructive translation has been employed as an effective method of debunking those imperial mythologies which underlie the ideology of the Russian world. A boost of verbal and visual arts as Ukrainian digital weapon took place long before the full-scale invasion, by the way. For example, Easter eggs painting on grenades called the combat or the offensive Easter eggs, писанки наступальні, is a telling illustration of the war-born art. The art appeared in 2015 in the Donbass area of anti-terrorist operation among the Ukrainian military. After the full-scale invasion, the art of offensive Easter eggs developed. The poster, which was broadly spread on the 2023 Palm Sunday, Verbna Neděля, is based on the traditional Ukrainian Palm Sunday greeting, when Ukrainians greet each other with willow twigs consecrated in the church and lightly hit their relatives and friends with them, reminding that Easter is coming soon. I don't beat the willow beads. Easter is a week from now. I don't beat the armed forces of Ukraine. A caricature post, Kuzka's mother is calling, with a woman drunkard calling to protect our red, also gained popularity. It first appeared on Facebook on June 24th, 2016, to the anniversary of Khrushchev's public use of the Russian idiom to show Kuzka's mother, addressing the then US Vice President Richard Nixon. This incident happened on June 24th, 1959, at the first American National Exhibition in the USSR. Kuzka's mother is part of the Russian proverb «показать Kuzkину мать» to somebody, to show Kuzka's mother to someone, meaning to teach someone a lesson, punish someone in a brutal way. The actual reference in Khrushchev's phrase, and this is a well-known fact, was to a code word for the atomic bomb nicknamed by its builder Kuzka's mother. Kuzka is a diminutive of the given name Kuzma. So Kuzka's mother is calling this particular slogan caricatures Putin's attempt to sell to his people the idea of war in Ukraine as the great patriotic war. Visual and verbal caricatures are often combined as syncretic art on posters and billboards. Moreover, in the southeastern regions of Ukraine, the language of the samples of this sarcastic genre can be both Russian and Ukrainian, and people do not distinguish between those languages because this is not the main point of importance, such as the one illustrating a double-headed Russian eagle being driven away with the trident of the coat of arms of Ukraine. A caricature of an eagle chased away by a trident pitchfork appeared on a billboard of the city of Odessa on March the 10th, 2022. The picture was supplemented with a text in Russian, by the way, stylized at the beginning into the biblical diction and finished with a low colloquial pattern. Don't covet the country of your neighbor, nor his freedom, nor his bacon, nor his Crimea, if you don't want his pitchfork to get stuck in your ass, in my translation. An entire collection of funny visual metaphors which refer to various aspects of Russian propagandistic viewpoint at the history of Ukraine can be singled out. For example, a montaged picture under the grotesque title, "The Monument Vladimir Lenin Founds Ukraine, Bronze Granite Alzheimer's," was posted on Facebook on December 23rd, 2021. The picture was reposted many times. It sarcastically embodied the Kremlin's concept of the origin of Ukraine from the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, founded by Vladimir Lenin in 1922. The figure of Lenin replaces the posture of Lebed, a legendary co-founder of the city of Kyiv, from the real monument to its founders. Brothers Cage, Czech, Horiv, and their sister Lebed, called Soaring Lebed, or simply the boat. Poetry has also been a mighty online weapon in the pre-February 24th. We are talking just about the pre-February 24th period. A new poem by a genius poet Lina Kostenko, "I żach, I krov, I smert, I відчай," became popular and recognizable by its first line. The poem exposes Putin's war against Ukraine. It was written in March 2015 when Kostenko joined the Humanitarian Action Second Front of the anti-terrorist operation. She handed over to the front line several collections of her poems, and on the title page of one of them, she wrote a poem by hand, which was quickly spread on the internet. I will quote it in English translation by a friend of mine, Svetlana Buchak-Jones, a freelance interpreter translator. "Horror, blood, death, and despair, the screeching of a vulture's horde, a little gray man has brought a black scourge. This is a beast of a dreadful breed, the Loch Ness monster of the cold Neva. Which way are you looking, peoples? Today's our turn, tomorrow is yours." Ukrainian self-mobilization and virtual fronts expanded on February 24th, when a citizen said, "I am the state," and the state said, "I am a citizen." Ukrainians resisted the aggressor's invasion with the tides of jokes. The funniest of them were massively shared and reposted on individual, commercial, and institutional web pages. Even if they first appeared on someone's personal page, they quickly spread through social networks, lose their authorship, and enrich the treasury of Ukrainian cyber folklore. Perhaps the most vivid example of a new proverb, which is an expansion of the traditional proverb, is the following: Ukrainians are invincible. When it's bad, they cry. When it's very bad, they sing. When it's very, very bad, they laugh, but they never give up. The traditional proverb was just that Ukrainians sing when it's bad, cry when it's very, very bad, and laugh, cry when it's bad, and laugh when it's very, very bad. But the expansion, the addition to this proverb made it new, and I should say that laughter through tears is a feature of Ukrainian character, as it is a feature of the Jewish character. This post first appeared on a private web page with a proverb on April 12th, 22, and that very day, it was broadly shared on several non-private pages. Over the next few days, already anonymous, the proverb with minor variations entered the narratives of many more users and YouTubers, and it is very peculiar for folklore to be spread in variations. From August 22, the network broadly published a renewed poem, again a new variation of it, as they said, without Soviet censorship, by major Ukrainian poet of the 20th century, Pavlo Tychina. Я стверджуюсь, I affirm myself. The poem starts with a telling declaration. Я єсть народ, якого правди сила, ніким звойована ще не була. I am a people whose power of truth has not yet been conquered by anyone. This poem, renewed version of it, was posted online by ex-president Viktor Yushchenko. It is an anti-fascist poem well known to Ukrainians from school, but it struck the nation to the core 80 years after its first publication. The verse posted by Yushchenko was liked by 47,000 users instantaneously almost, and left about 3,000 comments. What is touching here, on July 6, 22, Stanislav Aseyev, a well-known name, a famous author of documentary prose about the torture camp isolation in the Russian-controlled city of Donetsk, tweeted a picture of the receipt from a supermarket in the occupied city of Kherson with this passionate quote from Tychina's poem in Ukrainian: I am a people whose power of truth has not yet been conquered by anyone. In their own way, the employers in this supermarket bravely fought with Russian fascism. Periodistic translation as a deconstruction of Russian newspeak. Humorous deconstructive translation helps explicate the absurdity of the language of Russian war against Ukraine, because it is a nonsensical newspeak. Among the recent examples of neologisms in translation, deliberately shifting the meaning of the concepts generated by Russian propaganda are, for instance, a mocking noun повторун, a repeater, which alludes to Russian militaristic slogan «Деды воевали, можем повторить», grandfathers fought, we can repeat. Derisive noun «пересидент» about Russian President Putin, meaning that he пересидел, по-русски пересидев, has stayed too long in his office. Mocking phrase, узкий мир, I love this phrase. Узкий мир, a narrow world, which parodies the meaning of the ideology русский мир, Russian world. Mocking a position, mobik, or even a position, mobik, where the newly coined noun chmobik is an abbreviation of the Russian phrase частично мобилизированный, partially mobilized, and alludes to the abbreviation of the phrase человек морально опущенный, chmo abbreviation, a man morally degraded, from Russian criminal jargon. By the way, Russian newspeak also avails itself of Russian criminal jargon, and loves neologisms and euphemisms. So it's in Russian newspeak, it's a very peculiar combination of criminal jargon and euphemisms. So this mobik means a poorly equipped, clumsy, mobilized of the Russian army, if we extend it. And facetious, next please, translation of the Russian euphemism хлопок, a play on Russian words, homographs, chlopok, which is pronounced with the second syllable stressed and means a bang, and chlopok, which is pronounced with the first syllable stressed and means cotton. This word play became extremely popular in social networks, from where it was picked up and spread by Ukrainian media and news channels throughout the country. Ukrainian equivalent for the Russian word chlopok for cotton is bavovna. The Russians themselves started this euphemistic game by calling explosions at their ammunition depots and military bases chlopok, something smaller, not important, to downplay the significance and devastating effects of these explosions. Russian propagandists and the media tried to present such explosions as not significant. Ukrainians readily support this witty wordplay by using the word bavovna in place of explosions, and the phrase, for instance, powerful, next please, powerful cotton, чулася потужна бавовна, powerful cotton for loud explosions while talking and reporting about explosions in Russia. And not only the internet platform users, but also the official media journalists. For example, yes, in Ukrainian television studios, behind the backs of the hosts of news programs, the viewers can often see a branch of ripe cotton as a symbol of destruction of Russian military facilities. And still, even more than that, the symbolic image of cotton flowers entered not only Ukrainian television, decorative and visual arts, but also daily makeup, household, equipment design, even women's manicures, phone covers, etc., etc. Even you can see, for instance, on the screenshot of the news broadcast on TV channel with a news feed, причини бавовни в російському Белгороді, the causes of cotton in Russian Belgorod. So it makes no sense if you don't understand what it means. So similar to the case of bavovna, further please, lots of jokes draw on homographic wordplay. For instance, a post from social media which sarcastically interprets in the vein of dark humor the enemy losses is based on a popular Russian chocolate candy brand, Mishka Kosolapy, Clumsy Bear. The candy name refers to the famous painting by Ivan Shishkin, Morning in a Pine Forest, which appeared on its wrapper as early as 1913. The humor in this Ukrainian caricature of Shishkin's painting on the Clumsy Bear wrapping is built on the wordplay meshki в лесу, bags in the forest, instead of the mishki в лесу, by stressing the last syllable, meshki в лесу, instead of bears in the forest, with the stress on the last syllable, meshki в лесу. New candies went on sale in Russia for the May 9th holiday. Meshki in the forest. Unwrap and find your denazifier. And also Ukrainians have some food jokes, like enemy losses are like potato pancakes with sour cream. There are many of them, but still not enough. Wish there would be more. Let's go. Yes, jokes and memes about Stepan Bandera. There are lots of them. And for instance, here an example with a banderolka, which banderolka in Russian means a small parcel. The pun is based on the name of Stepan Bandera. In a dark humor exchange between Stepan Bandera, imaginary Stepan Bandera, and his imaginary Russian interlocutor, Bandera asks the Russian if they know the word for the euphemism cargo 200. Cargo 200, this is a military code word referring to the transportation of military fatalities. And in a dark humor, this dark humor exchange in Russian, well, Bandera asks the Russian what the word for the euphemism cargo 200 is, and he himself replies to the question that the word would be banderolka. banderolka. In this way, an innocent word, banderolka, acquires an even more ominous meaning, perhaps for Russians, that the euphemism covered 200. It is an image of Russian military fatalities in Ukraine, whose bodies are being packed and mailed back with a greeting from Stepan Bandera. And in terms of a monument, another picture. With Ukraine Mother, quite a recent one. Ukraine Mother, a former Soviet monument to the motherland, which is now renamed into Ukraine Mother, and Stepan Bandera standing side by side with an inscription at the bottom from the famous insurgent son. The inscription reads, "Our father is Bandera, Ukraine is our mother." And the next line would be, of course, everybody knows, we will fight for Ukraine, right? Then we follow with more neologisms, onomastic vocabulary-based euphemisms of the Russo-Ukrainian war. So Ukrainians have created lots of new words. They truly enriched their vocabulary beside other things. For instance, words based on the names of weapons, like Zabaktare, to kill the enemy, or euphemisms based on geographical names, the places of war battles, like Chernobyety, based on suburban village Chernobyevka, which means to do the same thing over and over without getting another result and suffer a lot because of it. Euphemistic verbs and phrases based on the names of well-known European leaders like Macronity, which derives from the name of French President Emmanuel Macron, and means to call often, to no avail, talk long and pointlessly on the phone. The phrase the phrase is not topical nowadays, but it had been topical several months ago, which derives from the name of the Chancellor of Germany, Olaf Scholz, and means to be constantly promising but not giving anything, and is grounded on the idiom "bogaty dudno," to do stupid things, pretending that you don't understand something. Euphemistic verbs and phrases based on personal names of the agents of Russian ground. For example, Zakobzonity, about to get to Kobzon's concert, which both derive from the name Yosef Kobzon, who was a Russian singer, who originated from the Donbass region, known for his crooner style, and he actively supported those Russian proxy republics, and Zakobzonitися, or go to get to Kobzon's concert, means to die about Russians. Telling nicknames of well-known political figures. Of course, you know the word Hitler, a combination of Putin and Hitler, but Ivanka Johnson-Nyuk turns out to be the president of the United States of America, Joe Biden. Because the first name Joe corresponds to Ivan in Ukrainian, and Ivanka is a hypochoristic form of Ivan, and Johnson-Nyuk means the son of Johnson. And Johnson is a reference to the surname of Boris Johnson, a former British Prime Minister who was the first to strongly endorse Ukraine in the Russian war against it. So Johnson-Nyuk is a follower of Johnson. Therefore, thanks to social networks and the media, the Ukrainian lexicon has been replenished with a number of words that reflect the realities of war. Some neologisms have already been codified in contemporary open dictionaries. In particular, the Myslovo dictionary records such innovations as Bavovna, Chernobyety, and many others. The online dictionary of the contemporary Ukrainian language, for instance, also has similar updates. For instance, Macronity. So these are newcomers of the current year. In the global arena, the Ukrainian language has become a source of borrowings and trendsetter in the field of neologisms. I will perhaps skip this part, or I don't know. You will just open the online urban dictionary and look for such words as Russianism, to be Ukrained, Russophobia, Ukrainian farmer, Ukrainian smoothie, Ukrainian tractor pull, even this famous prophetic wish to the Russian worship, go F yourself, entered the urban dictionary. When do you think? As early as February 25th, 2022, the very day it happened. Yeah, actually the news spread. Yeah, so historical dynamics and diversity of jokes. I would also this one, please, with yes, Leo Tolstoy. It's important. I will comment just on it. In the title of Leo Tolstoy's novel War and Peace, the word war was replaced with spецоперация, special military operation, as early as it was in March 2022, and it became very popular, this post. I saw it, for instance, in the hallway of Stockholm University in March 22, a big post. And this meme, but my point is that this meme isn't just about a special military operation. It ridicules the entire wanted Russian culture, the symbol of which is the figure of Leo Tolstoy. Yes, Ukrainians continued deploying their arsenal of war memes, fighting Russian propagandistic myths. As early as February 22, end of the February 22, the Twitter account Ukrainian Memes Forces, UMF, which aggregates Ukrainian counter-propaganda memes from Twitter and Reddit, was created as a semi-official tool of the resistance. I would quote several of the jokes. One of the most popular jokes of April 22 is in the online collection of Ukrainian jokes, and this is a huge collection, is the following. Did they take over Kharkiv? No. Did they take over Kyiv? No. What did they take then? They took a meat grinder, a mixer, they took a pair of Snickers, and they took a sliding door wardrobe. So, note that this is joke number 4,802. Could you imagine how many of them we have? During April 22, this joke appeared in multiple versions. Thematically closest to it is the November 22 joke, half a year later joke, also common in variations. Promo action for a Russian soldier, it's with letter Z deliberately. Whoever swims across the Dnipro River with a washing machine will get a toilet as a gift. Yes, did you? Yeah, it's very popular. They are the most popular ones, by the way, and I have tons of them. Yeah. So a little more than a year after the start of the special military operation, the following joke spread. Which one? But they could have taken Kyiv in 3 days, Poland in a day, and London on the 5th day. Why did they turn to Bakhmut? On this rhetorical question, let me finish my presentation.
Actually, after that performance, I just I actually am going to open it directly to any questions, because after that performance, but if there are any questions. Yes, yes. Okay. Okay, very, very good. Yeah. Well, I opened up with a somewhat serious thing about translations and assurances versus guarantees. And Yevhen just wowed the entire movement. Okay, now to our second important panel discussion session, and that is the memory wars in the realms of print media, broadcast media, and the internet. I really am happy to say that Pani Irena is with us, Pani Jarosewych is with us, and you've. I agree with Jurkiw. I don't think you need an introduction, but if you needed an introduction, one of the finest journalists we've had ever in the diaspora, and she was at the center of a lot of the events in '91. For that alone, she could probably write 4 or 5 books and so on and so forth. So I'm asking her to come as discussion leader, and then I'm asking those that are present, and I'm just grateful because both of them had to travel a very long way, and that is Bohdan Nahaylo, chief editor of the Kyiv Post, and our dear friend Nahaylo Bociurkiw, who also traveled, I think it's out of Odessa through Chisinau, so on and so forth. So welcome you both, and we will also have online Dr. Kormylo. I believe that he's on, yes, and so is Yevhen, yes. Okay, and I think we're still waiting for Diane Francis. You're going to be reading.
Her text, and Yevhen just wrote that he will not be able to come.
He cannot. So then, actually, he's giving us a little time back.
Yes,
but you do have Diane Francis. She wrote specifically for our event.
Yes.
Okay, very, very good. Then I would ask those that are present, Nahaylo and Bociurkiw and Pani Irena, to be here, and we've got the 2 on the screen. So, thank you. And Pani Irena, I know yours. Right here. And this is all yours? Yes. I know you're a master of this. I've seen you do this before. So it's all yours.
Jurkiw. Ready to go, where to sit, right? Andrew, ready to go? Okay, got it. Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Irena Jarosewych, Jarosewych, and I will be today's panel moderator. The panel will be offered in a hybrid format, remotely and on site, and we have now 2 experts with us here in New York. Michael Bociurkiw, longtime, I will introduce because while they may be very well known, this is being recorded for the future, and other people may not have the bios in the future. Therefore, Michael Bociurkiw, longtime journalist and foreign affairs analyst, co-host of the podcast Global Impact, serves as an expert commentator for CNN Opinion. He has been a speaker at the renowned TED Talks, including a TED presentation on the very topic this panel will explore: disinformation. Bohdan Nahaylo has a very distinguished career in the world of information analysis and dissemination, including as a spokesperson for and the head of the research unit on the USSR at Amnesty International. For more than 20 years, Mr. Nahaylo served as various positions with RFE-RL as a Soviet specialist, and currently he's the editor-in-chief of Ukraine's oldest English language publication, established in 1995, Kyiv Post. Joining us remotely are Peter Kormylo from Scotland and Yevhen Fedchenko from Ukraine. With a multi-decade career spanning academia and educational policy development, Peter Kormylo is CEO of the Ukrainian Information Service in London and fellow of the chair at the Ukrainian Studies at University of Toronto. Mr. Kormylo is the author of a recently published book, Scotland's Ukrainians, Their Story. Like both Mr. Bociurkiw and Mr. Nahaylo, Mr. Kormylo was and is frequently in Ukraine, meeting with officials, journalists, and activists.
With more than, Mr. Fedchenko, I have to skip, I'm sorry. With more than 30 years of experience in the media industry, Mr. Fedchenko is chief editor of the innovative fact-checking website Stop Fake and director of Nahaylo School of Journalism in Kyiv. During the academic year, fall 2022, spring 23, Mr. Fedchenko was visiting professor at the University of Pennsylvania's Annenberg School for Communication. An award-winning Canadian journalist and author, Diane Francis, was originally scheduled to appear on this panel, apologizes for a change of plans. However, she did ask that we read her presentations, which we will do later. The topic of this afternoon's panel, Russian-Ukrainian memory wars and the media, is wide and deep enough for several conferences. We are starting from the position of accepted truth that Russia has viewed Ukrainians antagonistically for centuries, and that a major tool of destruction used by Russia against Ukraine, whether Tsar, Soviet, or present, has been various disinformation narratives. While indeed it is curious why Russia still feels the need, even an imperative, to destroy Ukraine, and that question may come up during the discussion. During the panel itself, we will just assume this is a fact and will view several disinformation narratives promoted by Russia, as well as discuss experiences in blocking or fighting such narratives. Earlier today, we heard how Russia has used scholarship and academics to disseminate the core message of Russia as being big, good, and eternal. Ukraine is small, bad, and barely existing. This afternoon, panelists will discuss how media and journalists have been used to disseminate the same narrative to the general public with the ultimate goal of influencing foreign relations and public policy to exclusively benefit Russia. So let us begin with Mr. Bociurkiw. Nahaylo.
Yeah, okay. Thank you very much. We embarrassingly omitted from the bio that I spent quite a bit of time at the Ukrainian Weekly, creating quality journalism.
Yes, I'm sorry. Well,
I forgot.
I'm sorry. I also was there, so you're right.
And that was when Chernobyl happened.
Yes, that's really true.
Yeah.
He really, yes, I apologize.
No. Thank you to the organizers for inviting me. I must admit, I feel like a bit of an imposter. We have all these people with all these degrees. So I think you even have a doctorate, don't you? So I have a BA in English. Lada mentioned some of the words seeping into kind of everyday Ukrainian, and one of them is the shahida, or drones, Iranian-built drones that rain down on cities like where I live in Odessa and Kyiv. Another word they use are arrivals for incoming missiles. And you've probably all heard of the most famous dog in Ukraine, Patron. A lot of people are actually naming their dogs now Patron. So it's a very popular name. Also, something which Lada mentioned very interestingly, that this is indeed the first war in Europe to be fought. One of the front lines is on social media. A few months ago, I wrote an op-ed for Scene and Opinion, where we talked about how TikTok has served as a kind of virtual town square for Ukrainians, both in Ukraine and outside, especially the millions of asylum seekers who came to places like Canada and the US. They've used it as a place to laugh, to cry, to trade information and advice. So if you haven't gone there on TikTok, check it out. There's a lot of very, very well-produced videos by Ukrainians, again, inside and outside the country. So moving on to the topic here, here's a bit of a narrative from you. I'm currently actually editing an op-ed written by Lithuanian Lada Kolomiyets of Miami University. And I really had to pull this out because it really speaks well, I think, to what I heard earlier today, is that in Russia's case, it's the intimacy of empire extended to Ukrainians that justifies this war in their warped minds. She writes, the intimacy of empire entails historical ideas about kinship, love, and togetherness among Russians and Ukrainians. The intimacy is a hierarchical relationship where Ukrainians are little brothers in need of protection and tutelage. It's a relationship of giving, as in the case of civilization or violence the empire bestows on its subject. And a little bit of my own footnote here. Interesting and ironic, is it not, that as part of Putin's warped justification of the so-called special military operation, he says we're coming in to protect the Russian speakers. Wow. which cities have really taken the brunt of Russian missile attacks? Jurkiw, Odessa, and others. Yeah, Mariupol, exactly. Anyway, she goes, and just finish with her, she goes on to write that Putin's notorious article, quote, on the historical unity of Russians and Ukrainians delivered in the summer of 2021, half a year before the full-scale invasion, is a manifesto of the intimacy of empire. In the article, Russians and Ukrainians are great Russians and little Russians, fraternal people, one entity, a single whole. Of course, Putin argued that the kinship between Russians and Ukrainians has been transmitted from generation to generation. It is in the hearts and the memory of people living in modern Russia and Ukraine, in the blood ties that unite millions of our families, end of quote. I'll tell you that one of the things I've learned from working in this business, not for that long of a time, is that there's a distinct pattern that we see in the behavior of dictators. They very often telegraph what they're about to do. Why? Because they're egomaniacs. And it was when I wrote that, when I read that so-called essay, that I knew the light went off in my head. He's gonna do it. He's gonna do it. And he did. And especially you'll remember the weeks of military buildup leading up to the invasion. All the signs were there. And yet some people couldn't bring themselves to admit that this was about to happen. So at various times over the past several months, I've had the chance to face and confront some of the best Russian propagandists and Putin apologists that roam this earth. Primarily on Al Jazeera, where the Qatar-based media outlet makes a habit of placing pro-Kremlin stooges on programs like Inside Story. And the narrative is always the same. Russia is the victim. The West provoked Russia by extending NATO's eastern flank to the borders of Russia. How dare they? Russia doesn't target civilians in a special military operation. Western sanctions are unfair. The Black Sea Grain Initiative benefits wealthy countries the most, with underdeveloped countries in Africa and Asia receiving only a small sliver of what they should be getting. And that Kiev, of course, is essentially governed by Nazis. It goes on and on and on and on. And then I don't know if you've ever been across the table or on TV on one of these panels, but one of their most favorite guys to put on is Sergei Markov, Putin's former spokesperson. But I do have a badge of honor. I'm not on a Russian sanctions list, but Markov did call me a liar 3 times in half an hour on air. So there you go. Yeah. So without straying too far from the topic, I did want to say a few 4 or 5 things that I think you should know about the war in Ukraine. And from my perspective as well, I arrived there in January of last year. For the most part, I spent the whole time in Ukraine, except for coming in and out for events like this. You know, I mean, in the West, including Ukrainian diaspora, we've never, ever been in front, if you ask me, in front of the disinformation war. And it's hard to believe that we will be anytime soon, especially given the amount of resources that the Russians have been putting in the past many, many years into disinformation, troll factories, things like that. And take, for example, the pro-Putin network of dozens of accounts spread across Twitter, TikTok, and Instagram, known as the Internet Research Agency, supposedly set up by a guy who was publicly executed in the skies a few weeks ago, the head of the Wagner group. And when you look up the numbers, it's absolutely staggering. For example, between January 2016 and June of 2018, Internet Research Agency's total budget was over $35 million. Another source puts their monthly burn rate at 1.25 million. So if you compare that, for example, to what NATO spends on countering disinformation, it's really a pittance. You know, it was really interesting. I was recently in South Africa for the BRICS summit, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, recently expanded by 6 more countries, including countries such as Iran and Saudi Arabia. But anyway, it was really stunning to sit there. Of course, Putin wasn't there in person. He was afraid he might get arrested, but I don't think they would have. But anyway, his horizons are really closing in on him. But when he came on the screen, you could hear a loud cheer, like a very loud cheer for him among the delegates there, including African leaders. And one analyst told me from South Africa told me that one of the reasons, and you talk to average South Africans saying you're in a taxi or Uber or whatever, that they really admire Putin is because of this macho that he projects, and it really appeals to a lot of Africans, I am told. But I also noticed you could be sitting in a car and the FM radio could be on, and some of the top items broadcast are basically from Putin's speeches, parroting them word for word with no criticism whatsoever. Digging a bit further, I was reminded that one of the key reasons the Russians, people like Putin, are so popular in South Africa was, well, during the apartheid years, they were providing weapons and training. This is still very, very much remembered, what they provided for the African National Congress, which, by the way, most Africans agree with me, they're making an absolute complete mess of the country at the moment. Speaking of this countering disinformation, one aspect of my reporting, which I found is actually very unreported, is what's happening to a very, very important element of Ukraine's soft power, that is the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, headed by my friend Nawrocky-Torielli. But apparently it came from the president's office just a few months into the war. Their budgets were severely slashed, especially key diplomatic posts, Canberra, Ottawa, Washington, and others. So what's happening is that you have, for example, Ukrainian ambassadors, I've met with many of them by now, who have to get their kids to volunteer to do the social media. I recently met with Ukraine's very, very impressive envoy to Pretoria. She has something like 8 countries in her area of responsibility. 3 accredited diplomats in the Ukrainian embassy versus 100 plus for the Russians in South Africa, including a consulate in Cape Town. I mean, how can you match that? So my argument here, my point to make here is that I think we couldn't have chosen, the Zelensky government couldn't have chosen the worst time to cut the budgets, that this should be reversed and it should happen now. Even the Ambassador Kislitsa here, one of the best diplomats Ukraine has, struggles at the UN permanent mission. So I don't know if the diaspora can play a role in this in terms of helping support our Ukrainian missions abroad, but it needs to happen. In terms of my coverage of the war of Ukraine for outlets like CNN Opinion, is I've from early on characterized it as a war where history is repeating itself. Russian attempts to destroy Ukrainian culture, the relentless bombings of museums and libraries, the carting away of priceless historical treasures. Experts say it's the biggest, we've seen also the biggest art heist since the Nazis in World War II, intending to strip Ukraine of its cultural heritage. And I need not remind you what happened in Odessa a few weeks ago. The main Orthodox cathedral took a direct strike, as well as the historical district of Odessa. Just horrifying to see happen in real time there. Also, of course, we've seen the mass deportations of Ukrainians, including children, starting from 2014. When I was spokesperson for the OSCE, I categorized this war as well as a children's catastrophe. I think this is on the low end of the scale, but numbers of kids having been deported is officially, according to the Office of the President, 14,000. I suspect it's many more times than that. Then there's also the theft and destruction of Ukrainian grain. And you know what really bothers me? is that these images of what's happening, for example, in Odessa and nearby in ports like Izmail on the River Danube, Dniester, these images are flashed around the world, and you see grain silos, burnt grain or destroyed by chemicals or whatever. This is grain that was meant to end up on tables around the world, Africa, Asia, here. And I don't hear the outrage. I don't hear the outrage. It's something that really summons me. So whenever opportunity I get to explain this, I do it. And this is also an example of the war, ladies and gentlemen, coming to your doorstep. I recently met with a former colleague from UNICEF in Egypt, and she said, yep, our bread prices have gone way up. And that hurts families who are barely sort of hanging on by a thread. So I think the more we explain to ordinary Americans, for example, how this war is affecting them, how it's not a Ukraine war, it's not a Ukraine-Russia war, it's now a global war in terms of higher food prices, higher prices at the pump, how he's weaponized migration, energy, that sort of thing. I think that will ring home more, because as we're as we're coming down the months to the presidential election, I don't want to speculate on what might happen, but I think that's what the Russians are counting on right now, to beat out the clock, wait until the orange-haired guy, anyway, Mr. Trump or someone like him gets back in, and then a deal will be cut that is not going to be in favor of Ukraine. I think that's what the Kremlin is hoping for right now by dragging out this war. The other thing we've kind of been seeing happening in the war, and which I've commented on quite a bit, is how Russia seems to have escalatory dominance. Whether it's when Ukraine, and it's pretty impressive to see how far into Russian territory Ukraine is striking now, but we know this in Odessa, you've seen it in Kyiv, they do tend to strike back pretty hard, including by those Caliber missiles that were designed to sink big warships coming into the middle of our cities. But what I mean also in terms of escalatory dominance is that the threat of escalation has worked very, very well to delay Western assistance. It's taken a lot of time for Western leaders to grow the backbone to support Ukraine with what it needs: the tanks, the F-16 fighter jets, long-range weapons. This time I need not explain to you, but these gaps in provision has allowed the Russian forces to dig in along that front line, which basically is the same distance from, I believe, New York to Miami, but to create basically 10-kilometer zones of Dragon's Teeth, trenches, of minefields that are very, very difficult to overcome. So how long does this have to continue before the Allies realize that this is a pattern and it is not working? Putin bluffs, he escalates, and we back down, only to reverse the decision after several hundreds or thousands of Ukrainian deaths. And by the way, speaking of Minister Kuleba, he said the other day when the German foreign minister was visiting Kyiv, I don't understand why we're wasting time. We could have achieved more and saved more lives of Ukrainian soldiers and civilians if we already had those long-range missiles. And he was referring to the German Taurus. I talked about already, I don't want to go too much over time, but how this has become quite a global war in terms of the weaponization of food, migration, energy, and more recently the environment with the bombing of the Kakhovka Dam on the Dnipro River. By the way, the effects of which have basically ruined half of the summer tourism, what little tourists are left in Odessa, because of the debris, the animal carcasses, other things that have flowed into the Black Sea to our beaches. And that's on top of dealing with these marine mines that tend to float up on beaches and blow people up. Just going back quickly, and by the way, Odessa port infrastructure has been targeted about 24 times now since the Black Sea Grain Initiative collapsed. That's a lot. And my theory is that what the Russians are trying to do right now, like on the one hand, they'll say, oh yeah, we'll have a look at the Black Sea Grain Initiative. if you give us some sanctions delay for things like that. But in the meantime, what are they doing? They're bombing the shit out, excuse my language, the shit out of crucial port infrastructure. Crucial component of the global food supply chain is being bombed to shreds so that they will be able to come in a few months and say, well, Ukrainians don't have the capability anymore to export grain. They have to come to Russia. And I think having been in Africa recently, I think some countries are actually looking at Russia more. And of course, Putin is trying to tempt them with free offers of grain, but it's really a pittance what he's offering them, and the terms are very vague. By the way, and of course, it's important to mention, to remind everyone that what makes this war global is that whatever happens in Ukraine will dictate what happens several time zones away in the Taiwan Straits between Taiwan and China. Trust me, Beijing is watching every move, how the West is reacting or not reacting. And I can tell you from my Taiwan friends, they're feeling a little bit nervous these days. I think, and that's a bit of an aside, but I think Xi Jinping's hold on power is actually not as great as we had assumed it to be, and that he will become desperate like a Putin-esque person and do his dirty deed. Look, I don't want to sound too negative about things. Living in Odessa, one of the things that I'm really struck by, and I try to mention it as often as I can, is the irrepressible resilience of the people there. Absolutely stunning. And I think what started out as fear at the first days of the war, when this invasion happened, has morphed into anger. And in Odessa, which of course is a very entrepreneurial region, you're seeing people expand, innovate. The other thing I see, and I'm sure you have looked on, is that when these rockets strike or the drones strike, people spring into action right away to do the cleanup, to get churches back working, things like that. When the missile struck the Orthodox Cathedral in Odessa several weeks back, I went there a few hours later. There were little kids picking out the stained glass from the grass so that they could reassemble it. It is absolutely amazing. I'm going to try and wrap up here. I want to say a word, because we are here in New York City, about diaspora and their efforts. Of course, everything that is done here is noticed in Ukraine. My Ukrainian friends always remind me to thank you all for what you're doing. It means a lot for them, to them. But I also have gotten into some heated discussions, if I can put it that way, with diaspora friends about how many fronts are there actually at this time and period. Of course, there's the front we all know about, pushing back Russian aggression, but there's also the front line against corruption. And some people would argue that Kyiv should get a pass for the time being, suspend the battle of corruption, and focus on the war. I don't think so. I actually think that millions of Ukrainians have fled Ukraine for safer ground. Many of them are establishing roots. I think that if a built back better Ukraine is not provided to them, many will not come back, especially the young ones, especially the best and brightest. And this is also something that I tried to explain on Ukrainian television to Ukrainian authorities. Zelensky is making quite the public effort right now. Maybe you'll say a few words about that, but there is concern that recently he's made moves to put the corruption fighting units under the office of the president through giving SBU the responsibility. There are fears that when there are cases affecting the office of the president, that they could be shrouded or not dealt with at all. So I think that it's really important that as these hundreds of billions of dollars come in to rebuild Ukraine, that they do come with some strings attached. And there's one more area which I've been to a couple of the reconstruction conferences, including the recent one in London, which ironically, most of the media were locked in a dungeon there. But anyway, is that there's very little talk about funding the Ukrainian media. most Ukrainian media outlets, the big TV channels, who used to be almost exclusively oligarch controlled, are in very dire circumstances right now. What happened as soon as the war started, the Zelensky administration mandated that all of them become part of this 24/7 telemarathon, commercial free. And I think a lot of it tends to be pretty pro-Zelensky, which one would expect during this time, but they're not making any money. And they weren't in good shape before the war started. Hundreds of journalists have gone to the front line, either they've been drafted or they've gone to volunteer. Many have fled for safer ground overseas. My friend Natalia Sedletska quoted a figure when she was here at the Institute a few months ago, something like 200 newsrooms of local media outlets have closed across Ukraine. So we need to think about that. I think this is an area where diaspora could help because without a free, independent, and properly resourced media, there can be very little accountability. There should be no reconstruction without a free and vibrant press. That was, do I have any time left or am I on? I don't, okay. All right, just very quickly, one more point, because again, I wanted to go back to Africa because I've just come from there. This, I think, falls on the positive side of the ledger. You know, what happened was in 2014, when Russia illegally annexed Crimea, there was a lot of division in Africa in terms of how they voted. Some actually refused to condemn the action in the UN. However, in 2022, no African country supported the invasion of Ukrainian territory. My colleague, Rama Yade of the Atlantic Council says, these shifts show that some African countries, although tied to Russia through history and a variety of cooperative relationships, do not endorse Russia's use of violence to attack neighbors or annex parts of territories. And this is also, I'm finishing, this is also an argument I used on live Indian television recently during the G7, is that it's funny, isn't it, how India has remained very much on the fence during this whole conflict. And I said that it's time for them to pick the right side. And I said, if any country should understand the importance of sovereignty, territorial integrity, should be India. So I hope that message gets through. Thank you very much.
Jackie in the pilot. And it's very interesting you said that at the end about the media, because Bohdan and I, and really, honestly, great minds think alike. Literally, before you spoke, we're going to bring up that topic. I'm going to go, though, however, to maybe one more vote. We're going to alternate. So can we have Pan Petrov?
He's up, he can hear. Just tell him when he's ready.
Okay, Pan Petra, are you there? Because I can't see.
Hi, can
Are
you
you
hear?
hearing us?
Can you hear us?
Okay,
We cannot hear him.
But we can't hear.
we cannot hear you.
Okay,
Oh, now we can, now we can.
can you hear me now?
You can?
Okay, yeah, you got it. Repeat him again.
All right, let's try again. Can you speak, please?
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes,
You got me.
yes, tell him yes.
Yes.
With the microphone.
Tak.
Dobry, дякую. Dobry вечір. Good evening, everybody. It's actually late evening here in Bonnie, Scotland. Thank you for inviting me to participate in this seminar. It's been many a long month since I've listened to such an informative seminar as yours. You're probably asking yourself, what is the Ukrainian Information Service in the United Kingdom? Well, our service follows an agenda of tracking and scrutinizing three major elements of Russian aggression. We look at how Moscow's use of communications technology is used to deceive both international and domestic audiences. We look at how they defame Ukrainians and Ukrainianness by widespread repetition of the Kremlin's perennial distortion of historical narratives. And we've recently begun to turn our attention to the lack of academic objectivity and anti-Ukrainian bias in Russophile academic circles. And since the invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, we put out a weekly information sheet in the English language with links to pro-Ukrainian English language articles. But my subject this evening is the Galicia division, and the question is, where are we now? We all know that the Galicia division surrendered to the British and Americans on May the 8th, 1945, and after being investigated by the Allies and cleared of any crimes during the war, its members settled in Great Britain, Canada, the USA, and other countries. In Canada, the Deschênes Commission of February 1985 also found that this fighting unit committed no war crimes. Despite this, ad nauseam, ad infinitum, this week, once again, our monuments have become easy targets for the distortion and falsifying information regarding Divizia Halichina. And we're informed that the Ukrainian Archieparchy of Philadelphia is to cover up, quote, a Nazi SS monument in a Catholic cemetery. Now, the monument, erected roughly 30 years ago at St. Mary's Ukrainian Catholic Cemetery, which is owned by the seat of the Archieparchy, the Cathedral of the Immaculate Conception, gained national attention last week with a report in the Philadelphia Inquirer. A report on that monument and another in Michigan had appeared in a Jewish newspaper, The Forward, last month. For decades, Russian agents of influence and their paid malcontents have mounted a slow-burning but persistently constant disinformation campaign against the legacy of the Galicia division. Despite the passing of the majority of my late father's generation of diviziniki, it has been and still is directed primarily at present audiences in Western Europe and North America in the hope that other nationalities begin to view the Ukrainian diaspora with a negative lens. As usual, the disinformation regarding the Galicia division is deliberately constructed to be emotional and arousing. Well-informed and well-read historians know that between 1943 and 1945, 24 non-German divisions were formed in various Nazi-occupied European countries due to a shortage of German manpower. Among them, Ukraine, Holland, Denmark, Belgium, Italy, France, Norway, and others whose descendants are now part of the present European Union. All of these military units were designated as Waffen, or armed SS divisions. And to be sure, these Waffen SS divisions participated in military operations only and not in police actions. However, this persistence continues. We should bear in mind here Dean Jackson's 5 tenets of Russia's foundational abuse of the information space, where the Kremlin continues to cause chaos and confusion, sow discord, distract from certain issues, cast multiple doubt, and make the truth seem unknowable. In the UK, we are very conscious of how Kremlin-funded so-called academics are particularly intent on manipulating the Jewish and other communities which at present sit on the political fence. Their goal is to affirm pre-existing Ukrainophobe beliefs. For example, that all Ukrainians are anti-Semitic. In relation to the Galicia division's alleged Nazism, this has been achieved by manipulating, decontextualizing, and misrepresenting images, videos, and events. Now, these malcontent journalists and academics micro-target segments of Britain's Jewish diaspora to elicit a specific anti-Ukrainian emotional response of anger, fear, or disgust. The tools of these malicious international and domestic actors include fake news, forged documents, and divisive content on multiple social media platforms, including Google, Facebook, Reddit, Twitter, and YouTube. They induce cognitive dissonance by customizing information that conforms to pre-existing beliefs, thereby reducing scrutiny. And their arousal of emotion is achieved through creating divisive content over controversial issues such as race, patriotism, immigration, etc., to stoke fear, anger, and division. Now, the disinformation is a form of psychological hacking, which is commonly used to influence perceptions of both allies and their adversaries. And it's designed to increase trust of neighbors and friends, distort understandings of current events, and finally affirm that unflattering stereotypes are valid. And I should here add a word about yellow journalism. Second-rate reporting is common in the United Kingdom. We endure content from newspapers, magazines, or websites that is poorly researched and sensationalist. However, sensationalism increases sales and on the internet, clicks. Sadly, a huge proportion of the British population are given over to what Nina Yankovic calls infotainment, which we know as edutainment. That is, light on the information, heavy on the entertainment. And a huge proportion of the British people are not focused on the information or memory wars and seem not to care for the historical birthright of their political involvement. Many of them seem to be selfishly distracted and preoccupied by the ancient Roman palliatives of panem et circenses. Moscow funds many weaponized websites, all of which are equipped with powerful sharing tools. Share on Facebook, share on Twitter, share on email, print article, republish article, etc. Both the Ukrainian diaspora and the Ukrainian government cannot afford to ignore the proliferation of the crypto war and the creeping spread of the dubious works of malicious academics. We should take a lead from the League of Ukrainian Canadians' Project Facts. One example is their correspondence with a European university, drawing the faculty's attention to the practice of a particularly malicious lecturer who spends most of his well-sponsored time creating disinformation regarding the Galicia division when he should be concerned with disseminating truths rather than lies. And here in the United Kingdom, we have more than our fair share of Galicia division disinformation. So we were delighted with the outcome of the Deschênes Commission report in Canada and our own Hetherington Chalmers War Crimes Inquiry and the adoption of the War Crimes Act of 1991. However, these fact-finding inquiries seem minuscule in comparison with the toxic narratives that seem to be spreading exponentially. What then should I read to be well informed? Well, there are many Ukrainian language websites designed to combat fake news, but I also recommend reading scholarly works by non-Ukrainians. No scholarly work has been substantiated by any of the Soviet claims. One may refer to the following non-Ukrainian historians: John Armstrong's Ukrainian Nationalism, Nikolai Tolstoy's Victims of Yalta, Alexander Dalin's German Rule in Russia, David Littlejohn's Patriotic Traitors, for objective descriptors of the division's history. Regrettably, Soviet misinformation continues to fuel controversy about an issue that was solved by 1951. Now, Professor Lubomyr Luciuk, you'll recognize these words because I've taken them from your book, Operation Payback, Soviet Disinformation and Alleged Nazi War Criminals in North America. If we turn to print media worth reading regarding the division, interested journalists and historians would do well to peruse Wolf Dietrich Heike's Ukrainian Division, Galicia, a memoir, the Galicia Division 1943 to 45, Michael Logush, To Battle, Michael Melnick, Operation Payback, Lubomyr Luciuk, Undetermined Ukrainians, Olesya Chromeychuk, and In the Maelstrom by Professor Miroslav Shkandry. Besides accessing these well-written publications, what is the methodology we require to combat the abuse of the social media? Well, unfortunately, there is no quick fix. If we are not blessed with a natural gift for recognizing disinformation, then only media literacy training will go some fair way to strengthen our ability to assess and critically evaluate what we are experiencing. Only training and education can help us to recognize the emotions, biases, and stereotypes present when we consume media. Such training must focus on increasing critical thinking, source evaluation, and recognition of emotional manipulation. As one who has spent a lifetime at many levels of the educational hierarchy, I cannot emphasize enough that after victory, Ukraine has to seriously review the curriculum in its teacher training institutions. If madmen like Putin can attempt to falsify the history of Ukraine, then our post-invasion moral duty is to invest in Ukrainian language textbooks, patriotic Ukrainian teachers, and other educated personnel who know the facts and truths of Ukrainian history. Thank you for listening to me.
And reinforce, and we'll get back to it, that without even talking to each other, all the journalists come up with the same idea. Part of the reconstruction has to be outreach to the media, media literacy, and training of journalists, and spending money by the government of Ukraine to reach outward. But before we get back to that, Bohdan, you have a lot of experience with that, so yeah, absolutely.
I feel more comfortable standing.
After listening to the last few presentations, it's like Lesia Ukrainka, через сльози сміх. It's like the grim and the humorous. By the way, I also want to add a biographical note. I was with Radio Liberty for 10 years, but I was with the United Nations for 21 years as a senior policy advisor to the High Commissioner for Refugees, and I was a representative in Angola, Azerbaijan, in Belarus, among other places. So let's start. Well, it's an honor and a pleasure to be here. Thank you to the organizers. Good to see so many familiar, distinguished faces and new ones. Because of the limitations of time, I'll refer to my notes and to avoid meandering and to ensure conciseness. Hence also the rather telegraphic format and generalization in dealing with a broad and complex subject. Let's begin with the historical context. Remember, Ukraine's memory wars have not been limited to confronting Russian rapaciousness, but have in the past also involved other neighbors and indeed their friends and de facto auxiliaries in the world beyond. Until relatively recently, Ukrainians were very much on the losing side of these wars. The outside world was unaware, oblivious, or hostile to their aspirations, to the aspirations and plight of the Ukrainians, and readily absorbed the narratives that the enemies and oppressors of Ukraine, as a concept, movement, would be state promoted. And their aim was to obscure and destroy it, both because Ukraine's territory was a coveted prize, and because the idea of a distinct, nationally assertive Ukrainian people posed a threat and impediment to their imperial schemes. And why were the Ukrainians losers in this regard? Because there was no Kiev post. Let me clarify by rephrasing that, because there was no post from Kiev in the sense of Ukraine not being able to make its voice be heard in the outside world and to present its messages and case. And journalism and news, as we know, is about providing information, which in turn, depending on its quality and reception, shapes opinion and attitudes. The public and more direct cousin of diplomatic activity, if you will. Yes, the Ukrainians had plenty to say, to protest about, and to propose, but generally their narratives failed to reach an impact on the outside world. Moreover, they retained an introspective, defensive tone, understandably replete with moral indignation, anger, and frustration with what was perceived as an uncaring or even cynical world. Certainly, the odds were stacked against a people without an independent state, able to protect its interests. Diplomatic activity, even during the period of Ukrainian Cossack statehood, fell short of what, with hindsight, we imagine was called for to bolster Ukraine's image and standing. Ironically, Hetman Ivan Mazepa and his diplomatically industrious successor Filip Orlik failed to make much of a dent on European consciousness, apart from the Swedes, with some notable exceptions. And in fairness, it took a great modern Frenchman and European, Voltaire, to notify the world, or rather the burgeoning world of the Enlightenment in 1731, that Ukraine a toujours aspiré à être libre. Ukraine has always sought to be free. And 150 years later, who in the outside world, apart from perhaps within certain Russian political circles, were aware of the role of Ukraine's revolutionary firebrand, Taras Shevchenko, and his call for a Ukrainian George Washington? Hardly surprisingly, with Ukraine's modern resurgence at the beginning of the 20th century obscured and little understood in the external world, it failed to bring about proper recognition and independent statehood. Nevertheless, it did demonstrate its latent strength and political potential. Just as Pushkin had been wheeled out by despotic Russian Tsardom to denounce Mazepa as a traitor and castigate Europe's so-called slanderers of Europe, so in turn during the 20th century, such internationally acclaimed Russian literary stars as Gorky, Bulgakov, Nabokov, and Brodsky ridiculed the Ukrainian language and culture, even as the new totalitarian Soviet imperialists sought so brutally to eradicate, quote, Ukrainian nationalism, unquote. Divided modern Ukraine remained effectively muzzled, and fake news, so effectively used by Moscow against Simon Petlura and his followers in Paris in 1926, became the sidearm of terror. Even by now, the large Ukrainian diaspora proved largely ineffective in setting the record straight. In 1933, at the height of the Holodomor, it was the British and Canadian journalists Malcolm Muggeridge, Gareth Jones, and Raya Kleiman who managed to get news of Stalin's genocidal campaign onto the pages of some of the leading Western newspapers. After the ravages of the Second World War, the ongoing resistance of the Ukrainians, and the fact that Stalin had willed Soviet Ukraine to become a founding member of the UN, were Ukrainians better understood in the outside world? Not really. True, with the onset of the Cold War, the US provided them with important new means to speak to their compatriots behind the Iron Curtain through the broadcasts of Radio Liberty and the Voice of America. But their content was directed eastward, not to the Western world. Even during the post-Stalin period, despite the considerable efforts of the Ukrainian diaspora, the attention of the Western world remained focused mainly on Russian and Jewish dissidents in the USSR. The fact that Ukrainians made up the largest share of the political prisoners and what they stood for was overlooked. The voices of Ukrainian specialists and journalists from the pre-war generation heard occasionally crying in the Western media wilderness were indeed few and far between. These included most notably Bohdan Osachuk, aka Alexander Korab in Switzerland's New Zürcher Zeitung, Boris Levitsky in Western Germany, and eventually, occasionally, Bohdan Bociurkiw and Roman Shporluk in North America. The emergence of a new generation of patriotically minded democratic standard bearers of the Ukrainian cause, promoted in a modernized form, conforming with recently acknowledged universal norms, nevertheless galvanized elements within the Ukrainian diaspora, particularly among the youth. In the first half of the 1980s, preceding Gorbachev's proclamation of glasnost, something similar took place in the West. Suddenly there were signs of a breakthrough as representatives of the new post-war generation trained in Western universities and journalism began to appear on the pages of some of the West's most prestigious publications. Adrian Karatnitsky and Alexander Motel in the US, and a certain Bohdan Nahaylo in the UK led the way. The far-sighted successful engagement of the American and British scholars James Mason, Robert Conquest by the Harvard Ukrainian Research Institute to produce a groundbreaking work on the Holodomor, Harvest of Sorrow, helped to broaden the front in the memory, or rather ideological front with Russia. By the end of the 1980s, Gorbachev's relaxation of controls precipitated the rapid growth of the various national democratic movements within the USSR, and this empire was tottering. To fill a massive lacuna in Western knowledge and awareness, I wrote a history of the Soviet nationalities problem called Soviet Disunion, which was published in London and New York in 1990. And was then followed by Japanese, French, and Italian editions. In July 1990, I was confident enough to tell CNN live that it was game over for the Soviet Empire, now that Ukraine had finally managed to reassert itself. Ruchнула Ukraina. But even at this pivotal stage, it was not plain sailing. You will recall that two of the West's most prominent leaders, the Iron Lady Margaret Thatcher and George Bush Sr., were not keen at all to see the Soviet Union disintegrate and still preferred Gorbachev to salvage it via a new union treaty that the non-Russians didn't want at all. And the KGB, meanwhile, was seeking to impede the work of Radio Liberty's highly popular broadcasts, bringing the truth and strengthening national awareness. Soviet jamming had stopped in November 1980. Think of that, as late as November 1988. And I was appointed director of the service shortly afterwards, as millions of people stayed glued to their radio sets. The tactics used against us through Soviet American agents of influence was to allege anti-Semitism, of course, or promotion of fascism. Why? Because of our recalling the proclamation of the restoration of Ukraine's independence by Bandera's followers in Lviv on June 30th, 1941. But by now, these last-ditch efforts to scupper our work had little impact. The bigger challenge was to build from scratch a network of reliable correspondents within Ukraine itself who could report the news reliably and regularly. It was for that purpose that the US management of RFERL sent me to Ukraine in June 1990. I was the first Radio Liberty official to be allowed into the Soviet Union, which, as you know, was defined to survive for another year and a half. That was the written part, now the improvisation. Because I've heard a lot here, and obviously I don't want to stay stuck in history. So we did manage then to set up an embryonic network, and I must mention Sergei Naboka, great journalist that he was, who was the head of the Kiev correspondence punkt in Kiev. But look, modern Ukraine, as we know, let's be frank, was plagued with modern independent Ukraine was plagued with growing up pains and disadvantages that it had inherited from the Soviet period. It didn't really mature in the way that we would have preferred during the next 30 years. And what did we see? What did we witness? A low level of political culture, greed, oligarchs emerging, cynical leadership, and all of this, together with corruption, translated into media, and also into the approaches to history, or rather the relationship with Russia. On the one hand, the official one, the playing along with Russia, and then the unofficial one with civil society and braver, more outspoken, courageous historians trying to set the record straight. And yet there were internal demons to be overcome in the historical sphere. The search for historical objectivity. Not all historians, having been trained in the Soviet period, were up to it. And many of the young ones were already influenced by their paymasters or political gurus that they had adopted. So we had difficulties with the polls. dealing with Volhynia, the massacres. We had difficulties in facing up to how the Jewish Holocaust had actually taken place. What had been the role of the Ukrainians, passive bystanders, active participants, victims themselves, questions that were not really addressed, exposing us to continuing charges from the outside. And as I mentioned before, the 22nd of January, 1918, why was this obscured? And why did we only concentrate on the 24th of August? Just because the communist majority in the parliament in 1991 had willed that, and that had been the terms of the compromise. And then when we look at other things, you know, the rush through effort to get a Thomas by Poroshenko, however important symbolically, and yet just before the elections, incidentally, where we ended up not with a patriarchate, but with a metropolitanate, and with Filaret being sidelined. All of this was putting journalism to the test. And of course, many journalists became the servants of the oligarchs that paid for their TV channels or newspapers. And remember also, there was a huge problem at this time with the Trojan horses, the Russian Trojan horses within Ukrainian society and the body politic, the fifth columnists who were constantly promoting the Russian narrative. Fortunately for us, even despite the failure to capitalize on the added attention that we got as Ukrainians from the Orange Revolution, and then obviously the Revolution of Dignity attracted for some time attention to Ukraine. We did manage to capitalize on that to the extent that was possible, and it was left largely to outsiders. The appearance, the writings of Timothy Snyder, Anne Applebaum, Anders Aslan, Diane Francis, and others to get Ukraine placed on the map and be better understood. Ironically, Ukraine's best literary export were not the patriots that we thought should be perhaps representing Ukraine, like Zabushko, Andrukhovich, and Bohdan. Kurkov, an ethnic Russian, writing in Russian, becomes the most famous writer from Ukraine, representing Ukraine, a sign of the times. But what is happening internally? Bloggers reign. Suddenly, you know, Facebook becomes the source of knowledge. Instead of a Ukrainian BBC, we have Baba Babi Skazala, you know, which the grapevine forming attitudes. And so we have freedom of the press. But what is the quality of that press that we have? Many of the journalists I've met, I wouldn't say would qualify as journalists in the West. Too much editorializing, too much, yeah, me, you know, this is what I think. What about the news? Who, what, when, why? You know, provide the basics. We don't want to know what you think. You know, maybe when you're much older and you've got a name for yourself, we'll read your opinion columns. But this is the thing. Or getting on TV, presenting a TV show, you know, with an oligarch behind you and talking for hours and sounding so important. So yes, a free press, but what quality of that press? Anyway, the war of 22, after these mammoth game-changing elections of 1919, 1920, where to the surprise, especially of the diaspora, Poroshenko loses and 73% vote for change or vote in protest against what has existed, against the corruption, lack of, shall we say, openness, etc., etc. And we suddenly have a new guy in power, Jewish origin, a Jewish background, Russian speaker who switches to Ukrainian, an actor, shades of Ronald Reagan, who becomes, after a while, rises to the challenges of war that comes quite soon afterwards and becomes a great communicator. I mean, when has Ukraine ever had anybody on the stage, whatever you might think of him as an individual and where he came from and his background. But when have we ever had that opportunity to be so present, omnipresent on the world stage, in the parliaments of the world, on screens constantly, that today perhaps there's a backlash and there's not just a war fatigue, but maybe a Zelensky fatigue, particularly on the part of many politicians out there or parliaments who think that maybe he's gone too far. He's too outspoken now, you know, he's cracking the whip and demanding too much. But for Ukraine, obviously, this new symbol of a president of a changed Ukraine, of a Ukraine in transformation, not just in war, but transforming itself, where a political nation is emerging, finally crystallizing, and that he is the embodiment of that. That has been a godsend to us at a time of great trial, suffering, loss, etc. So what's needed at this stage? Oh, the other thing is, of course, the ground rules change. I'll start summarizing now. The ground rules change. As we know, not just in Ukraine, we've shifted away from newspapers. TV was the all-important factor for many years in Ukraine, hence the oligarchs were so interested in controlling the TV channels. But internet becomes increasingly important, social media. Look at the way that the Telegram channels have sprung up as sources of information about the front, but it can be anything from pornography to the battlefield now. All go there, you know, it's amazing what is happening in that world. And of course, the bloggers. This is the age of the bloggers. Anybody who's got the confidence to talk for long and sound convincing will have followers and people will take it as gospel. And one of the dangerous things here is that we have personalities that have emerged almost out of nowhere that for 6 months, a year become household celebrities and oracles and founts of knowledge. Several of them have disappeared off the screen, but what was his name? Jarosewych, for example, until recently, and many others like them. And people get their news from that, not from informed journalists who try to be balanced, check their facts, deliver the goods as per the etiquette of journalism, which is a worrying sign in terms of where we're going, where we're heading. Now, the other thing that I wanted to say there is that in this climate, it's very difficult to plan ahead and build for the future. We need, as has been said, we need proper journalism. We need better trained journalists with Western standards. Not only do we need, in terms of conditionality, accountability in the economic and business zones, governance, but we need a better training of journalists. And perhaps some of the institutes out here and centers can focus not just on history and politics, which are very important in the memory war, but fighting the memory wars, the selective memory wars, not wars, by having the people that can face up to them and can carry the fight to them, both on the external front, but internally. The challenges are huge that await us. When victory finally comes, in whatever form it will take, maybe not the form that we would prefer, the task of reconstruction, modernization, managing billions and billions and billions of dollars, managing Ukraine's credit and trust before the outside world, its own trust as a society and in the mirror before itself, having stood the test of war, is immense. It's very challenging. And it is very important, as I've heard just before from Michael and from others here today, that we have a genuine, thriving, independent press of the quality and the level that is needed. I'll finish, let me blow Kyiv Post trumpet now finally, but this gives you an example of how we've developed, because Kyiv Post is just part of the broader picture. And I'm not going to comment about who's better, who's worse. I mean, we have a lot of good publications, not all of them, unfortunately, equipped to inform the outside world, informing the internal world, the domestic world, but not necessarily with the outreach to get the messages across. But for example, Kiev Post, in its former incarnation before the war, had a monthly circulation of about 300,000. That's the internet and 10,000 hard copies, right? We are now at over 2 million per month, right? 2 million individual readers. Guess where the majority are? The US. 59% of our daily readers are in the US. Strange.
No.
Less than 10% in Ukraine,
All of Washington.
Canada, London, etc. So that is amazing because, you know, under the previous incarnation, in different conditions, low war, not so much interest in Ukraine, they were reaching about 1 million readers per year, right? Now we're having, and we're growing fast. The role of social media has become amazingly important. The flagship is, of course, the site where such distinguished opinion writers as Dr. Luciuk there, who's graced our pages and others appear, but yourself. But look, people, what are they reading? Twitter, TikTok, Facebook, etc. And that's where we have to now divert so much of our energy. This is the media of today. And that, as we've heard, is where we've heard from our friend from Scotland, that's where the Russians have also invested a huge amount of money. So the new battle lines are out there. I'll stop here now and just say, what did I want to say? That final word. Final thought. This war has speeded our maturation as a nation, as a state. You know, we were sort of still in a childish stage, and we have to get out of the me, yeah, davai. We have to have more sophistication, better understand the outside world that is helping us, and be a team player in international efforts, be more universal in our approach. When did Ukrainians ever really care much about the outside world? Never. You know, let's be honest. I worked in the UN for 20 years, but now the world owes them. It does, because this is a broader fight. But in the new Ukraine, we have to be part of that, you know, international solidarity. And on the basis of the heroism and the example that Ukraine has set, it needs to play a role, a leading role in setting standards, leading the good fight, as it were, in the future, and returning to what I said at the very beginning, not be introspective, out there, moja chata z kraju, ale dawajcie nam I tak dalej. Thank you very much for your attention.
Because at 6:30, there's going to be there's supposed to be a 12 hour. So the bottom line is, I have a suggestion that Diane Francis's letter to us for the video.
Let's talk for, hold on,
Yeah.
before we do that, okay? Let's go ahead and right away.
Saying no, because we still have the troops thing, and at 6:30.
Oh. We're not the last ones?
We're not the last.
Oh, sorry.
Okay, so
Yevhen is above us.
and
Okay, okay. Vlad, we got it. Okay, so let me just quickly say, Vlad, okay. We're going to go to Yevhen in just a second. I do want to tell you though, with Diane Francis very quickly. For those of you who don't know her, she's an excellent Canadian journalist who writes very well about Ukraine, and you can go, she will be publishing this particular piece that she was going to present today on Monday. So go online and Google Diane Francis and you can read what was going to be read today. We were supposed to get the premiere of it, but you can wait till Monday. Okay, Yevhen, good to see you. Jurkiw.
Thank you so much for inviting me to talk. It was a great conversation because the topic is very central to what Stop Fake is already doing for more than 9 years. So basically, we are trying to fight in this war of narratives, the war Ukraine is fighting right now is a war of narratives because this war was preconditioned by Russian narratives. This war is conducted with the help of Russian narratives. And I'm afraid even if the kinetic part of this war ends, we would not see the end of the disinformation war Russia is conducting against Ukraine and the whole world, because obviously in the information warfare, Ukraine is not the only country Russia is fighting against. Definitely, the whole world is a front line for that type of the war. More than that, I am absolutely convinced that the more Russia would be losing the kinetic warfare, the more resources would be deployed to non-kinetic instruments of fight, like disinformation, cyber war, media leaks or intelligence leaks, if you wish. So those components would dominate the agenda, and that domain would become even much more important than kinetic domain. That's why it was very, very important from Ukrainian point of view to start such project as Stop Fake for early recognition of those malign narratives, and also for fighting back because those narratives were building gradually on a daily basis, and that's exactly how disinformation is organized. So they were repeating the same messages during long period of times with the same, sequences to make sure that those messages stick to the minds and hearts of people in Ukraine, in Russia, and in outside world. So it was very important not only to do debunking as Stop Fake was doing, but also to do pre-bunking, to actually predict what narrative is Russia is trying to push, and to localize the impact, malign impact of those narratives. So it was mentioned already here, the narrative of Ukraine as a fascist state. This is just one of the examples of those narratives which was built through decades. So it was even not the matter of years, and it was very important. You previously mentioned that, but it was actually the matter of decades and decades. And it was started still by the Soviet Union, and the same instruments were used against Ukraine. And it was important from a referential point of view, because every time the journalists were mentioning that Ukraine is a fascist state, they could relate to their information from the kind of previous historical periods and say, like, look, Ukraine was already, doing that for years and years. So that's exactly how it's built. So from our point of view of debunking, it's not only important to debunk the story as it appears, but also to do that for the record, because then people would be look up for those stories, and it's important that they would be finding not only what Russia was pushing, but also they would be finding our debunking. And that's also important from archival and historical point of view. Also, that's important from the point of view of building counter-narratives, because it's a battle of narratives. And if there is any gap in information supply, obviously it's immediately filled with your adversary or your enemy, and that's exactly how this system is built. So that's very, very important to build Ukrainian or own narratives. And coming back to Ukraine as a fascist state, just to give you one very recent example, As you've seen, former British Prime Minister Boris Johnson was awarded the doctorate at Lviv University last week, and immediately it became a subject for fake news that he allegedly was given the Rome salute, the Nazi greeting while receiving the degree, and that was done as a graphical meme, and it was immediately spread on social media. And it was playing a very important role, demonstrating that it's not only Ukraine is a fascist state per se, but it's also supported by other fascist states. And it's very actively built into the narratives that actually it's not Ukraine fighting this war, but it's a proxy war which Russia is fighting at the territory of Ukraine with Western countries, United States, United Kingdom, the whole NATO. And this narrative plays very strongly for Russian domestic propaganda purposes. So basically by portraying Johnson doing that, they were getting many messages across to different audiences, to the Russian audience, to British audience, of course, to Ukrainian audience. And that, again, one of the features of disinformation. So they really try to target different audiences with very specifically tailored messages. So, of course, from this point of view, it was important to connect those messages. And
Пане Євгене, я дуже вибачаюся. We are really tight for time, so I'm going to summarize very quickly the purpose of Stop Fake for those who are not familiar with it and have not gone on the website, and they really should, is precisely, it is about the only tool in Ukraine right now that consistently fights against disinformation. And all of us here have been saying that in the reconstruction period, Stop Fake has to be multiplied by 100, plus we need to build into the reconstruction Ukraine looking outward with facts and truth and training media in the future. What Stop Fake just want to tell you personally, wonderful work. I wish you had the budget that the Russian disinformation agencies have. You deserve it.
yeah, actually, even without budget, we are trying to reach out because, as I said, it's very important not only to talk to Ukrainian audiences, which is doing quite well already with the level of media literacy, which was dramatically improved by the beginning of the war, unfortunately. So Ukrainians are very quick learners in this, but also we already talk to foreign audiences in different languages. So now I am sitting in Madrid, where we opened the Spanish language hub. So we talk to audiences in Latin America, which was already mentioned is one of the most important regions where Russian soft power is very, very strong. And in terms of the building the presence of Ukraine in the global south, it's very important. We also do the same in French. We do the same in Turkish. We are also opening the Arabic service very soon. So we are growing, and I think it's absolutely unprecedented because we are the only Ukrainian media organization which has such a wide presence abroad. And that's also very important because, as I said, it's not only important to fight against Russian disinformation narratives, but also to build Ukrainian narratives and make sure that we have the networks to deliver those messages and those narratives, because it's all a matter of networks right now. If you don't have the platforms to disseminate, it's impossible to talk to people in different parts of the world. That's why also it's important to be present on social media. And the last important point, in the very latest issue of Foreign Affairs, Andrei Kolesnikov from Carnegie published an article, The End of the Russian Idea. So that's very important to understand that, yes, probably Russian idea, the idea of Ruski Mir and Russian imperialism might be close to the end, but would it make bigger space for Ukrainian idea? Automatically, no. We need to work very, very hard to fill the space with Ukrainian idea. And before that, we actually need to define what Ukrainian idea should be at this very point. For example, when the war ends, what kind of message we want to deliver to the world.
Yes, that is absolute, Jurkiw, that's a perfect ending. We're not taking any questions, I'm sorry. Come again next year, I'm sure this issue is not gonna go away. All right, thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Dr. King. Okay. Okay.
Just 2 minutes. I mean, I forgot I was rushing. 2 minutes. First of all, on Kuleba and the foreign ministry, I wanted to say one of the perhaps tricky things is that the MFA in Ukraine has really been sidelined. And the spokespersons for policy of Podolyak, Yermak, people closest to the president, who are now speaking constantly on that. I'll stop there. That's one.
Actually, I actually would have had this go on and on because you folks are the best in the business. And on Fedchenko, I don't know how to apologize that I'm keeping you past midnight. And the fact is, I just discovered that someone had told me that they were doing music practices here at 6:30. We have gone over an hour. That's because I'm really sorry about all of that. I should have done much better timekeeping. But it was so fascinating. I did not, in the same way as with the academics, we have the very best journalists in the world today, right here, on the Ukrainian issue. And so I wouldn't want to stop any of you guys, because you guys were that good. That's all I can say about that. And then I have that troublesome character, man, Lubomyr, who seems to be. Yeah. So Lubko, as always, thank you very much, Yevhen, for this. Lubomyr really doesn't need any introduction. He's been doing this, and he knows this in form. In his blood. He's been doing this for 40 years. He actually has realized how damaging it was for the last 40 years. And so he's come up with a way to resolve it. He and Petrovich went into the archives and said, let's publish it in English, the universal language, and that's what it's got. That's what his story is going to be about. Go ahead.
I've been anxious all this.
Well, I'm the rear gunner, and that guy usually gets killed. So, thank you again, Watts, for putting me at the end of the program on the last word. It's not going to be the last word.
It should be the last.
I think we're all agreed, though, this is not something that's going to end anytime soon. I want to say just a few things. I'm going to try to keep it quite short. The war against Ukrainians that we've all referred to, I think has given Ukrainians in the diaspora and in Ukraine and in the homeland the best chance ever to tell our story.
Yeah.
I think that the war for independence being fought in Ukraine today has given us the best chance ever to tell our story. In my lifetime, in your lifetimes, no one has ever talked about Ukraine as they talk about it today. And that's been won by the heroism of the men and women fighting on the front, but also by many of you in the diaspora who've done the work you've done. So I think now's the time for us to win the memory war. That's number one. Number two, Waz spoke about veterans, and we all began talking today about Mark van Hagen, who I only got to know in 2003, 2004, when I was one of the people that organized the campaign to have Walter Duranty's Pulitzer Prize revoked. And Mark wrote a piece on that. And as a result of his journalism and his scholarship, that debate went to the highest levels and went global. I was inspired by that. And one of the things I did after that, although I didn't meet him for several years after in person, was to actually develop a series of plaques around the world recognizing the righteous people who told the truth. People like Gareth Jones. We put up the first plaque to Gareth Jones in Wales at the University of Aberystwyth in 2006, the world's one and only English, Ukrainian, Welsh Gaelic plaque. The Welsh were delighted. If you go downstairs right below where I'm standing, there is a plaque that we put up in 2018 to Raphael Lemkin, the man who called this famine a genocide, a classic example of Soviet genocide. The world's only English, Ukrainian, Yiddish, and Hebrew plaque, right here, right below you. Go take a look when we're done. Now, I want to talk about the memory wars, and I'm no spring chicken to this. I began struggling with these issues over 40 years ago, particularly in Canada with the Commission of Inquiry on War Criminals, the Deschênes Commission that you heard about earlier. At that time, we suspected that the Soviets were behind disinformation being spread in the West about alleged Nazi war criminals in Canada and the United States, about the Divizia and so on. But we weren't sure. And I wasn't sure really until the fairly recent times when two things happened. One, the war against Ukraine escalated in February of 2022, a war that was preceded by Putin's essay that's been referred to several times already today in 2021. Now, I have to say, and I want to be very frank about this, when I read that essay on the historical unity of Ukrainians and Russians, I called several of my academic friends and said, we should publish his essay with our responses to it because this is actually a call to war. And Michael Bociurkiw, I think, said essentially the same thing. And I'm not going to name them because they'd be embarrassed, but every single one of my academic colleagues, with one exception, and that was Professor Mogochi at the University of Toronto, said, nah, that's not important. That's what they said. That's in my diary. I keep notes. So, number one. However, when Putin did launch his so-called special military operation, what did he actually say? Do you remember? When he said he was launching this special military operation, this limited military operation, what Putin said was the war was against the Banderivci. He actually used that phrase. I was shocked, because I didn't believe that anyone in the 21st century would use that as an excuse for invading a neighboring country. Frankly, I just thought it was completely impossible. But then we have to think about who Putin is. He's my mirror image in a way. He's the mirror image of some of you. He is a third generation secret policeman. His grandfather served Stalin in the Cheka. His father was in the NKVD. He was in the KGB. And now he's the KGB man in the Kremlin. And he and his Confederates, mainly ex-KGB men and the oligarchs that he's corrupted, have waged a war against the very idea of Ukraine, as he sees it, personified, demonized, in the persona of the Banderivci. And how did he signal this? If I could see the first slide, please. He signaled this by showing us who he thought was important. Just as recently as May Day of this year, when in Red Square, in Red Square, sitting on his right-hand side was Yuri Dvoykin. Yuri Dvoykin was one of the KGB men who fought against OUN and UPA in Western Ukraine in the late 40s and 1950s. And here Putin is having him sit right there on the dais with himself in Moscow for the parade. Now, not many people turned out for the parade. Apparently this year they were a little short on armor, but I don't know what happened. But there is a clear example of where Putin's worldview is. And of course, that main theme has been consistently, we've heard it from several people already today, Ukrainians in the diaspora, Ukrainians in Ukraine are Nazis, fascist collaborators, war criminals, and so on. That is a theme that has been suggested many, many times. Now, again, during the Deschênes Commission, a very difficult time in my personal life because this was a contentious issue. It pit the Jewish and Ukrainian diasporas against each other. This was a time that I wish I'd never gone through, but I sort of cut my teeth on it. I must also admit that. We always thought that it was the Soviets who were behind the disinformation campaign. But it wasn't until Olga Bergenson, who's sitting right there, found the document about Operation Payback or Operation Retribution, depending on how you define it or translate it, that confirms that it was indeed the Soviet KGB that deliberately provoked tensions between Jews and Ukrainians and the Baltic communities in the West in order to bring down any possibility of unity or cooperation between Jews and Ukrainians throughout the West. This document is black and white. They openly brag about how they did this in the United States and then how they were so successful in the United States that they created the equivalent in Canada. And they say the Deschênes Commission. That's in the book that you can get if you'd like, that confirms what they did. And this had consequences in the West, and it still resonates, and you heard people talk about it. So if we look at the next slide, you'll see how various Ukrainian churches, cemeteries, cultural centers, and so on throughout the West have been, so there's a couple of slides there. That was the book. There's the actual document that you can see for yourself. It's been translated. And here's an example of one of the attacks that's occurred in the recent past. This is in Edmonton, the Jurkiw monument, actual Nazi. Now, I'm just going to tell you a funny story about this one. When this gentleman did this attack, he didn't realize that a few months before we put in surveillance cameras with ultra red light film. So when he went there and spray painted it, we got a picture of a man about my size wearing a baklava and jeans and a jacket and so on. And oddly enough, a man at the same shape, build, size, same clothes minus the baklava came back the next day at 9 o'clock in the morning with camera equipment to take pictures of actual Nazi, then posted them on his website because he's a good blogger, and showed us what an outrageous thing had happened. This Nazi was, the public was outraged, they spray painted it. Well, he's in front of a court coming up in next year, early next year, and hopefully will be prosecuted for what I consider to be a hate crime. But this has happened to churches and cemeteries all across the West. So Operation Payback came out as a book. Again, it's back there, it was, got some copies for you. That exposes the Soviet disinformation campaign. This was not enough in my mind. And so over a decade ago, having heard that the Ukrainian archives were going to be purged or closed, shut down by a new archivist, I went to Kyiv. This was about 13, 14 years ago now. I met Volodymyr Vyatrovich for the first time. And with some support from various community organizations here in the West, we brought out a large cache of Soviet-era archives about the OUN and UPA collected by the KGB. And then I began the laborious process of going from one person to one organization to another, begging for money to get it translated, done brilliantly by Marta Olinik from Montreal, to address a number of questions that gave us the sort of focus of the book. So I went to Vyatrovich and I said, here are the most important questions in the West about OUN and UPA. Who were they? What were their ideals? What did they fight for? Who did they fight against? Who did they fight with? Did they collaborate in the Holocaust? What did they do? Who were they? Now, I had a sense of it because mi tato OUN UPA. My mother was a slave laborer. I grew up in a community of people who had gone through the Second World War. So I thought they were good people, but everything I'd read and heard and been told in the Western media told me something different. So finally, I went and I got the archives, I brought them back out, and after a 10+ year process, the worst project of my life, because it sat there on my shoulder all the time, whispered in my ear, hurry up and finish me. We got the book out, and the book came out just in time for Putin's special military operation against Ukraine. So thank you, Vlad. You helped sell books.
5,000 word essay.
Yes. Well, then now if we go to the next slide, I'm going to go through these very quickly, but these are just some of the images from the book that show you what the OUN and UPA looked like. Next slide. Taking the oath, collecting intelligence in the forest, celebrating Easter, the bunker complexes, the women and men who were there together. All these women you saw were killed. These are the Soviet agents that acted against them. Slow down. Those were, in some cases, groups that disguised themselves on false flag operations, pretended to be UPA, went into villages, killed people, and then the UPA got blamed. So some of the stories you hear about villages being attacked by UPA, killing people, innocents, and so on, are true, except that they weren't really members of UPA. They were Soviets in disguise. The Soviets launched a brutal counterinsurgency campaign against OUN in UPA. It lasted well into the late 1950s. In fact, the last known case of an active UPA unit was 1962. So some of you probably remember that. And there were even incidents after that fact that may have been sort of linked to the insurgency. The idea, as I say, was to try to understand who these men and women were and how they were dealt with. And as I say, the Soviets dealt with them with brutality over a period of well over a decade, and it culminated in things like the mass deportation through Operation Vistula and other elements of ethnic cleansing that finally subdued the insurgency. But it took them at least a decade. And you'll see a few examples in the next slide of how brutal that looked. Trophy photographs of killed insurgents. The technique would simply be, you've killed an insurgent, you prop his body up in a corner, you parade the entire village through. If anyone looks at him and looks like they knew him, you arrest them, you take them to the side, and you interrogate them. So imagine putting this woman up holding the corpse of her husband or someone she knew, or these women typists who were part of the UPA support services murdered, killed in battle. These are tough photographs to look at, but that's what it was like. And this is a trophy photograph of Jurkiw. Of all the archives that were preserved by the KGB, the Jurkiw ones were the ones that were the most vetted. Out of some 32 volumes about Jurkiw, only one survives. But we have it, and we've reproduced some of the documents of the book. Kuk was the man on the right, was the last actual commandant of the UPA, the commander, and that's the building above Jurkiw where he was finally killed in battle. So those are the kinds of documents that Vietrovich and I thought needed to be printed, published in English, and distributed widely to libraries around the world. I'm very pleased that thanks to Putin's war against Ukraine, the first edition has now sold out, which I could have never expected, frankly. It's 1,000 pages. And I thought, who's going to read this? Well, apparently it seems to be making the rounds. So you've got some copies thanks to WAS out there, but it's going into a new printing. We've made a few minor changes. There are maps there that are the first time that we've ever actually shown the political geography of the OUN and UPA. Where were they? Where did they fight? Where were the great raids? Who did they fight against? We've done it cartographically. We've done it with an extensive index. The index alone is some 50 pages and it's thematic. So it shows you who and what the OUN and UPA were, how they were suppressed by the Soviets, but never defeated. And this is, I think, the point that I'd like to sort of end up with. Get to the next slide. This is the way they portrayed themselves as men and women who are fighting for a free, independent, sovereign, united Ukraine in Europe, men and women who are allied with other nations in the Soviet prison of nationalities who are all struggling together. Today, when we stand shoulder to shoulder with our friends in the Baltic states and in Poland and throughout Western Europe and throughout the world, yes, there were problems in the past. We know about Volyn and so on. We treat that in the book. But the OUN and UPA saw themselves as fighting for the freedom of individuals and the freedom of nations. These were their ideals. And the point really here is, if you move forward to our present time, what are the armed forces of Ukraine fighting for? They're fighting, well, if not us, who? And how did that echo to our time? The last slide, you'll remember him. He was executed on the 30th of December, 2022, Alexander Mickiewicz, during the Battle of Bakhmut. And what were his last words? Slava Ukraini. Slava Heroyam. Thank you for your attention.
You can breathe. And I can honestly say, because even a good partisan like Oleg Blahy is beginning to tell me, man, you know, signaling that we really have overdone it. For the first time in my life, I've done 150 of these conferences. For the first time in my life, I let everybody say what they needed to say. And I really didn't put a time limit. We had time cards. I didn't put a time limit because you've just heard there wasn't an ounce of fat in this group. You've just heard some of the best of the best. These are the folks, man, that have been fighting. I told you they were all veterans of the war, of that information war. These were the veterans of the information war, and they're telling you that we really do have to knock it up a branch and stuff like that. And I actually, Bohdan, I'd let you go on, because you were absolutely right. Your Cave Post represents some of the best in our business. So and it gives the information. We just wish there were just a lot more of that, because in Washington, they do read this stuff. Luciuk's stuff is now being circulated. Professor Shkandri's work has been, Walter's work, Pani Olia, your work now, and Pani Lada, I would take it everywhere, because the bottom line is the stuff that you bring to this, the humor. You know, this wonderful woman, full professor at Fedchenko, who's now doing Ivy Dartmouth, but tells better jokes than just about anybody. I'd have you entertaining everybody. You know, you did that in Washington. I knew you'd do it here. So with that, with all of that, I am just very grateful to all of you for having had the patience and sort of the fortitude to be able to get through all of this, and with the Stupid Day Parade, and with Moss Robeson standing outside, and so on and so forth, that you did it. And so I invite you to a very, very nice reception in the Crystal. Okay, and with that, I end this. Thank you. Jasper, yes.